I was raised Protestant, sort of full gospel more, to be honest with you. Hint of evangelicalism, heritage of Mennonite and Dutch Christian reform. So there's a lot of stuff in there. And then in the other parts of the heritage, there's like the Huguenots, and there's like a lot of French stuff, so I'm assuming there's some Catholicism down in there. The Morels. Hey, there's actually Morels that follow me on Facebook, so maybe they can talk a little bit more about that religious background stuff. What I'm trying to say is my paradigm that constructed the life that makes my thoughts, or something like that, is like based on the Bible. Now, I haven't followed all of those religions. I barely followed any one, but my father said to me, son, read your Bible every day and pray. And so a good habit I developed was to read my Bible. Maybe I did it all day instead of every day, and not every day, if you know what I mean. So I sort of listened to my dad. Maybe I didn't hear exactly what he had to say. That's just, growing up and stuff. But I go on Facebook and I see these posts about Tartaria and this ancient architecture, and there's like energy in the ether, stuff like that. And I think that's cool. I always had a little bit of a fascination with dark caves and tall pyramids, and I want to say like monolithic structures, but that might not be the word. Megalithic, yeah, that's the word. Megalithic structures. And I was fascinated in like the Inca lions, the Inca lions, in the Peruvian desert and stuff, and ley lines, and Nikola Tesla. Some reason I had a fascination with that guy. And there was like this spiritual side that was kind of like taboo, right? Because I read the Bible and I had all these background ideologies and philosophies and stuff that sort of kept me from delving deep into Tesla. And I was thinking about it. The reason I mentioned I didn't really study the religions was that somehow about the year 2001, maybe a little earlier, I came across this preacher in Guelph, Ontario, and he had done a study on the book of Revelation. And how I got to this is quite fascinating. It goes into my history, and it ties some dirty, dark, terrible things that happened in church when I was a youth. One day I'll probably open up into that. But suffice to say, I was rummaging through some personal effects of my family. They told me to do it. And there was this box of cassette tapes. And in that box of cassette tapes, thousands and thousands of preachings. The container came from a preacher who ran like a couple of different churches over his lifetime. And so he had amassed a collection of these cassettes. I think they were donated to him. I don't think he bought them. Maybe the privileges of being a leader or something like that. I never went to seminary and I have zero interest in doing it. Many people have told me to do it. But long story short, I came across this bundle of cassettes. And I rummaged through and I found as many as I could. I was missing a couple of them. Maybe like 1 to 7 or something. I might have even lent a few out. So I don't have the physical copy so much anymore, but I do have recordings. I put them from cassette and I digitized them. I think it was about the year 2001. And the study is called like historicism. So there's basically three camps of studying the book of Revelation. And one of the camps is historicism. And the reason I bring this up is because they use the book of Revelation and the scrolls and how it's a story three times told. One physical, one spiritual, and one, I guess, religious, if you will, something like that. And so the historical side of it, or the physical side of it, chronology from ancient Egypt until Rome, when this book was written. And it actually goes into the future from John's perspective, John Pajonas, up until, I suppose, just past the Middle Ages. And it talks about Rome being divided and then being revived. And so, according to that, in my studies and such, I would assume that America is the second Rome, only by, like, looking at all that stuff, which interestingly ties Tartaria, because they're, like, they've got this other hashtag about Tartaria, and they claim mud flood. And they're saying that, oh, if you look at America, it's actually Egypt, and they've hidden it, and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. I haven't studied it, and I really don't care much about it. The point I'm bringing all this up is they're saying that history has been like a fable to us. It wasn't actually as they propose it has happened. But then the book of Revelation, if I follow it as a historicist perspective, would verify actually the secular structure of the timeline that we have been fed from ancient Egypt time until, I suppose, 2025, if you will. If you don't buy into that, oh, we're living in a mixed dimensional soup or blender or something like that. The suggestion that some of us from the time zone that I would propose I'm originally from would say that our heart is on our left. For all intents and purposes, growing up, I've always known my heart was on my left. And then they're suggesting that today there is also a converged timeline that says our heart is actually in the center of our chest. Fun stuff. What I'm trying to say here is that my paradigm was constructed on biblical suggestion or biblical basis. And I can't throw that out the window without, like, pretty well logically and reasonably falling apart, if you know what I mean. Like, it could literally, maybe not literally, because I'm not exactly sure how the brain perfectly operates. I have a general idea and a really vague and, like, studied but surface knowledge of how the brain works. But I was thinking, like, if I change that, then there's so many other things that would fall apart logically, because, well, it's a construct of big picture to details on the one side, and on the other side is details to big picture. So if I'm logically rewriting that thought process in my brain, then it could fall apart, and the pathways might not work correctly the way they should. Anyway, that's social media filling in stuff that I never would have thought about, like Tartaria. Never would have thought about it. But then I'm thinking about the historicism and the biblical perspective. And this came to me a while ago. There's, like, you know, looking at the history of humanity and the written record of it, trying to figure out the age of the earth. And that comes from, you know, listening to this guy, Kent Hovind, back in late 2000s, maybe 2003, I guess. Yeah, 2003, 2005, mid 2000s, before the first decade of 2000s. And he suggests that the earth is 10,000 years old by like the flood or whatever. So I was looking into that, reading the Bible and studying the kings, and then basically trying to jot down years. So I got to this stage and I was reading a part in the Bible where it talks about the story of these wars, and the leader was to pray that the sun would stand still, or a prophet said, the sun will stand still until the battle is won. Something like, to this effect. So in other words, there was a time in a day that extended beyond a 24-hour period. So the sun stayed its course, or whatever like that, paused its course, if you will. So it doesn't line up to perfectly suit exactly as time today would run. And the account that was given there would have said that the day would be bright. Now, that's from the Middle East. And if I look at the story from, let's say, perhaps South America, then it would be told a different way. It would be told something to the effect of, the night stood still, and the night was longer than the night is occupied in a normal time frame. Is that coherent? I think so. So then I'm looking at Tartaria, and I'm saying, well, perhaps Revelation just didn't cover Tartaria because it was in the place where the story wasn't being told. You know? So because it was in a place where the story wasn't being told, Tartaria, or it was in a place where the story was being told, and Tartaria wasn't a part of that, it was just neglected to be input. It doesn't mean that Tartaria didn't exist. Yeah. However, there are suggestions that from the history records, Tartaria was stricken out, literally, like covered and omitted. And we hear stories about this as we read the Bible, that, you know, there were things that were stricken from the records, both the Persian times and the Egyptian times, and I'm sure other times that maybe weren't mentioned, or maybe were mentioned, and I just, for the sake of the length of this video, I'm not going to cover it. Yeah. So I'm thinking about my paradigm, and I'm just trying to have some coherence of the reality of the world that I live in today, and the reality of the world that was lived in then, and how I can think about stuff. And the important message that I just want to put across around the world, to myself and to everybody else, the end all and be all for this is to love everyone always. That's it. If we just focus on love everyone always, this world will be a whole much better place. It said, whether you want to believe the Bible or not, that's okay. But the ultimate message that I understand is God is love. And when we choose to live in love, we don't really choose. As we decide to live in love, we're being godly. And, you know, they got the yin and the yang. You have the opportunity to not live in love, and that's just ungodly. So, in order of importance, it's often said that cleanliness is next to godliness, and both are right on the top. And it doesn't matter what religion you're in. I think the goal is to be morally, not superior, but morally aware, and to live and act and dwell within that moral position. Not as egotistical, not as arrogant, not as supreme, but as responsibility, right? If I get hurt, my responsibility is to love, not to react. I think that's the biggest thing. I think that's the biggest takeaway. So whether my paradigm allows Tartaria to exist, or whether Tartaria really did exist, or whether this is just some scheme to sort of level the playing field of color or non-color or whatever culture or what have you, I think the real purpose of everything is to love everyone always. I'd break my paradigm just to love everybody always. Yeah. So much to think about in this life. And sometimes what we don't have is yelling so loudly that we're unable to think about those things that are the most important. So if you're dealing with anything because you want it, or you're dealing with anything because it's just not in your possession, don't be afraid to slow down and meditate and really discover those things that are worthy to think about. And this is a message more to myself than to anybody else. I just gotta slow down and really ponder what is absolutely valuable when I want those things that are yelling at me and I can't hear, or I can't calm myself enough to distinguish what is the real valuable, worthy thing to think or do or remember or aim for. So here I am, just taking a moment, slowing down, figuring out a paradigm that allows myself to love everyone always. Carry on. Have a good day.